was a little bird with a song. The bird was singing all on her own.
Well, hello everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Meta-Ideological Politics. And again, I'm joined by my buddy Greg Dember, the meta-modern guy and expert. So Greg, great to see you. Welcome back to the show.
Yeah, it's great to be back. Always great to talk to you.
So as some of you know, Greg and me and Nate did a episode on metamodernism before. So Greg is a returning guest, and today we're going to explore and get a little bit deeper into core metamodern themes and ideas and see how they relate, if at all, to meta-ideological politics, and whether they do or do not. I still think these ideas are really interesting and really important to talk about, and also have a lot of value in terms of how we understand what's happening culturally and in the arts currently. So regardless, I'm looking forward to this conversation. Did you have anything to add to that, Greg, in terms of the opening frame?
Yeah, no, in some ways, just with what you said now, you kind of addressed a question that I had, but there's obviously is overlap between, to me, there is an overlap between metamodernism and meta-ideological politics. Um, but I kind of did want to know, like how much are you into just talking about metamodernism, or do you want to really narrow the focus in on that overlap? And then why have you brought me back after our previous discussion? Like, what is it you want to get into today?
Yeah, great question. So I see this as, let's start by going as deep as we can into meta-modern ideas on their own terms, irrespective of meta-ideological correlations,
Okay.
and then see if something pops up at the end. And I wanted to explore a lot of themes around this idea of oscillation and multi-perspectivalism, which is something we've talked a lot about
Hmm.
between the two of us, and some of the limits of multi-perspectivalism, and what it is, and how multi-perspectivalism relates or does not relate to metamodernism, and then some other ideas that I feel like might have some overlap with what I'm doing implicitly with MIP, especially in regards to like your emphasis on protecting the interiority of something from deconstruction, or protecting the
Hmm.
integrity of an idea or an object at the level of the thing, without, instead of, to use object-oriented ontology terms, instead of undermining or overmining. And there's something
Yeah.
about that frame that really resonates with me, like a kind of a non-verbal, intuitive level. So I wanted to kind of
Hmm.
put it under the
Oh,
microscope,
cool.
yeah, and
Okay,
unpack that more.
this does sound like fertile ground for a good discussion.
Awesome. Great. So let's start with looking at this idea of oscillation, and also contrast oscillation with what it is not. Right. So maybe just
Okay.
to really open it up, let's start with you just explaining what is oscillation, in the metamodern context,
Yeah.
and why is it such a core concept in metamodernism, and if at all, how does your work in metamodernism emphasize or not emphasize oscillation to the degree
Hmm.
that someone like Vermeulen and Van Denneker have emphasized it?
Yeah. Okay. Um, so the term oscillation came into the metamodernism discourse um, because Vermeulen and Van Denneker used that in their kind of opening essay from 2010 called Notes on Metamodernism. And it is a really important concept in metamodernism, but at the same time, I actually want to say, and I know Tim would agree, he's actually said this, that I think people have actually latched on to oscillation a little bit more than is appropriate in understanding metamodernism, because what they were really talking about was a relationship between modernist and postmodernist aspects or polarities. And then in constructing the sentence in which they, explored that, they chose the verb oscillates, and they kind of expounded on the sort of imagery and metaphor that evokes. But like, it's not that metamodernism is about oscillation. It's that metamodernism is about a relationship, and this is in Vermeulen and Van den Ecker's kind of construal of it. It's that metamodernism is about a relationship between modernist qualities and postmodern qualities, and the way they characterize that relationship is with the verb or the image oscillation. So it's not that metamodernism is about oscillation between any two poles on any continuum, like, it's not like chocolate and vanilla, or conservative and liberal, or Republican and Democrat, or like that. It's between modernist and postmodern qualities, like the famous one that everybody knows about, which is irony and earnestness, or irony and sincerity, or however you want to put it, but also between fragmentation and unity, or between relativism and absolutism, between context and object independence. It's oscillation between things like that, not oscillation in and of itself.
That makes sense. So if I'm understanding you correctly, oscillation is the word they chose to describe the relationship or the dynamic between modern and postmodern qualities or sensibilities.
As they're found in metamodern cultural products. Yeah.
Right, right. And it sounds like some people, including myself, got more hooked onto the word oscillation, when really that was just the word
Right.
that was chosen to describe the relationship between modernism and postmodernism.
Yeah. And I'm not saying that they could have used, any other, hundreds of other verbs besides oscillation. They explain in that essay why they say oscillation and not like juxtaposition or blending or integration or things like that, because what the relationship that they're characterizing is one in which a cultural product will, it's like a swinging pendulum. So it will appear to fully embody one end of the continuum. And then like the way a pendulum works is, as it swings to one end, the gravitational pull to bring it back to the center grows stronger and stronger. So it's got some momentum pushing it in one direction. The very act of moving in that direction is what impels it to ultimately then reverse direction and go to the other end. And it doesn't stop in the middle. It keeps going, and it goes to the other end. So a metamodern, it's not that metamodern cultural products simply, blend, like cherry pick a few cool postmodern qualities and a few cool modernist qualities. It's that they fully become one and then fully become the opposite. And furthermore, and this is something that I don't think actually Tim and Robin made clear in their piece, and it might be my own idea, but I think based on the examples that they've given and other examples that I've come up with, this oscillation that we speak of is taking place in the perception of the audience or the reader or the viewer of the thing. So when I am experiencing the music of, say, Sufjan Stevens, the music is just what it is. The music's not like oscillating or whatever. I will go through an oscillation of, at one moment, going like, oh, this is really serious. This is like some really deep, profound, it's religious. It's like this really profound, vulnerable expression of his spirituality. And then as it gets like more and more intense that way, then I will have the reaction of like, oh no, he couldn't be serious. Nobody could be this serious. He's being lighthearted and tongue in cheek about it. and then certain little elements of it kind of emerge, and I'm like, oh, the fact that he's standing on stage wearing butterfly wings when he performs a song, it's kind of, you're not supposed to take it too seriously. And then as I get deeper into that, then it oscillates and it comes back, and I'm like, oh no, he is really serious about it. And it's the fact that he can be so lighthearted in certain aspects of the presentation is actually sort of indicating that it's to be taken seriously on an even more profound level. And so the meta-modern cultural products kind of elicit that sort of process. And I'm not saying it would be conscious and articulatable in every audience member, but it sort of works that way, maybe in a background way for people, if that makes sense.
That does make sense. That's very interesting. So you're saying it's more a phenomena that takes place in the minds of the audience rather than it's objectively built into the cultural product?
There are things built into the cultural product that tend to lead to that kind of dynamic in the audience's reaction.
Right. It elicits that kind of response or that kind of.
Yeah, but it's
Yeah.
not, when they say oscillation, they don't mean like the first half of the song was sincere and then it oscillated and the second half was ironic. It's not that simple. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. I'm thinking about the show Community.
Yeah. Great example.
That's the only real example of a cultural metamodernism I'm familiar with, but multiple times in the show, the oscillation would occur.
Yeah.
In one 20-minute or however long episode, right?
Right.
So that one moment it feels like this real sincere, heartfelt, deep moment was kind of radiating through the TV screen. And then the next moment it would be like, oh, and then we're back to this kind of joking, ironic, sarcastic mode, and then it'd switch again. So I'm internally doing this dance, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And then again, like even that relationship between modernist and postmodernist qualities that they identify as being important to metamodernism, even that is not like fundamental to what metamodernism is. They started from the point of observing, and this was in the like first decade of our millennium, like around 2005, 6, 7, 8. And they were noticing, for them, the first trends they noticed were in painting, but then also, in a show like Community and in music. And I think they were really interested in freak folk originally at the time. And they were noticing all these things that didn't seem to be explainable in the terms of postmodernism. But the point is that they saw, they empirically saw these cultural products that, gave off a vibe that seemed to be in common amongst each other and didn't seem to be explainable as postmodern and didn't seem to be explainable as a simple return to modernism. So then they set about trying to characterize them and come up with a terminology to explain what these different cultural products had in common. And so, one of the things that they noticed that was salient was this oscillation between modernist and postmodern qualities. But it's not that they started off top down theorizing about the oscillation. It's that they noticed a big collection of stuff that on an intuitive level felt like it all had shared a certain character. And then they began to attempt to elucidate what is it about these things that they all have in common that makes it seem like it's unique to our moment, right? So you can explain them in terms of oscillation between modernist and postmodern, but you can explain them with some other things. And they talk about in their 2017 book, the subtitle is I'm going to get the sequence wrong, and then the book is right behind me, so I could just check. But the subtitle is like depth, affect, and historicity after postmodernism. Or maybe it's depth, historicity, and affect. I always forget the order. so the subtitle's not oscillation between modernist and postmodern. It's actually the return to depth, historicity, and affect. And historicity means the idea that like the grand story of society is moving forward in a direction, which had been challenged by the postmodernists, who said we've actually attained a sort of stable, self-perpetuating state because of the nature of capitalism and the kind of way where society has landed. So we may have actually come to the culmination of history in Western society. And Vermeulen and Van Denneker said, no, it looks like we've actually jumped out of that stable pool, and so we have a return to the progress of history, and we have a return in our aesthetic cultural products to an interest in depth, whereas postmodernism was about surface, and an interest in affect or emotion, whereas postmodernism was always a little bit sort of embarrassed by the emotion. And in my work, I think there's a parallel between their sense of depth and affect with what I call felt experience or interiority, which you alluded to earlier. And I picked that up from another theorist named Raoul Eshelman, who has his own sort of theory of what comes after postmodernism, and it's called performatism. And to me, the methods that the qualities and characteristics of performatist works, I think, are like a subset of metamodernism. And he's not so comfortable with making that connection, but I am. And what I really like about his work that wasn't as present to me in Vermeulen and Van Denneker's, though, is his emphasis of the postmodern works, whether you call it performatist or metamodern, having this interest in showcasing or protecting interiority, subjectivity, felt experience. So when I talk about metamodernism, I kind of like take a little bit of Eshelman and mix it in with Vermeulen and Van Denneker's ideas, and then some of my own, other ideas. So in my work, I feel like there's a whole set of aesthetic strategies or methods that creators can use, like they can pick out of many in order to protect interiority. And the oscillation between modern and postmodern qualities is just one of them. And to be fair, I think in their work after the original essay, boy, I'm going on long here. In Tim and Robin's work after that sort of initial essay from all the way back from 2010 now, that's 12 years ago, they've also gone on and, gotten interested in other methods or strategies besides the oscillation. So that's just all to say that, like, yes, oscillation is important, and it's not that, but it's this, but it's also not the sum total of what metamodernism is. Okay, I better stop.
No, that's great. I think I remember reading a little bit about Eshelman's work in a book called Supplanting the Postmodern.
Yeah.
And it kind of samples, and V&V's work on metamodernism was in that book.
Yeah.
But it was like, these are 15 different examples of speculations of what comes after postmodernism. And they all had a lot of similar qualities in my view, from what I remember reading that book in 2019 or whatever. So there are three places I want to go to. So let me kind of bracket my thinking here. So let's go back to oscillation and when we're talking about kind of moving between or looking at the relationship between modernism and postmodern qualities, I'm wondering where multiperspectivalism as a distinct quality of postmodernism entered into the mix. So a few questions just to throw out how I'm thinking about this, right? So would one like move between the multi-perspectivalism of postmodernism and a modernist, whatever is the equivalent of multi-perspectivalism, is
Mhm.
moving between those things its own form of multi-perspectivalism in the sense that like I'm moving between different modernist and postmodernist perspectives. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Like where does multi-perspectivalism fit into the mix in metamodernism?
Yeah, I feel like to not go like philosophically insane, um, you should limit the application of multi-perspectivalism to object level comparisons. So multi-perspectivalism is where you go like, well, the Democrats have some good points and the Republicans have some good points too, or well, chocolate ice cream is good and vanilla ice cream is good as well. I can't settle on one or the other. And it would limit, I would be limiting my intellectual depth if I were to just glom onto one position and never consider the others. Like that's multi-perspectivalism. When you start oscillating or whatever between that and maybe the modernist alternative, which is conviction. Um, let's not call that multi-perspectivalism. Let's call that metamodernism. So metamodernism's relationship to multi-perspectivalism is that you you oscillate between having that multi-perspectival view and having a unitary um, universalized, answer to a particular question. So the modernists would say, we're smart enough as humans to actually figure out the truth, and the truth is objective and it applies to everybody. And um, sure, there may be other people out there who are kind of just as smart as me and they're coming to different conclusions, but ultimately one of us is going to be right and one of us is going to be wrong. So, either capitalism is the best way to run society or communism is. But I'm pretty sure that capitalism is right. And the more we explore this, we will probably finally get to one answer and they'll probably get one over. That would be the modernist point of view. And the postmodern multi-perspectival view would be to say like, well, it's all relative to your position, and there's, the human mind is actually limited in its capacity to discover the truth, and whenever you think you know something, you're probably missing part of the picture, and 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 such. So the most honest approach is to constantly consider all sides of a story and constantly consider one assertion and its opposite. That's a way of characterizing multi-perspectivalism, which I feel is postmodern. A lot of people have, I think, really wrongheadedly assumed that that's what we're talking about with metamodernism, and it's not. The metamodernism is the oscillation between the modernist and the postmodern view. So, on the one hand, you are certain, you are relatively certain about your position and you're committed to it. And then you oscillate between that and having a sort of recognition of the potential truth of the others. So I think it would just get too crazy making to go, that is to say that's a kind of multi-perspectivalism too. Let's just use multi-perspectivalism to talk about the object level stuff and then say we're oscillating between conviction and relativism. And that's a meta-modern thing.
Yeah, that's a really interesting distinction. And we clarified that through what level of abstraction we're working on, right? So the
Right.
multi-perspectivalism being reserved for object level takes is kind of like the importance of having like a nuanced opinion, right? Especially with complex
Mhm.
political issues. But
Yeah.
So my critique of multi-perspectivalism as a central orienting philosophy, and why I don't think, and why I agree with you that metamodernism should not be categorized as multi-perspectivalism, is because one, I think it presupposes a complete decentralization of one's perspective. Like you don't have a core view or a core conviction that you stand on, and you're just completely lost in contradictory, multiple perspectives. And my second problem with that is pragmatically, no one actually does that. Like I've never seen any human
Right.
being be a real multi-perspectivalist, even if that's the philosophy or ideology that they explicitly proclaim. And it's kind of a similar
Right.
critique of postmodernism in that no one is a moral relativist in how they live their life. Like you can nominally say you're a relativist, but if I say, well, let me go punch you in the face and kill a bunch of your friends, hell no. Like that's not, they're going to act as if you're an absolutist in some way. And so when you don't embrace that, your sincere convictions, and put that on the table, then it just you kind of look like a hypocrite. It's like, no,
Hmm.
I'm a multi-perspectival fluid, blah blah blah, but you don't act like you are. Because
Right.
the human brain doesn't work that way, right? So I feel like the meta-modern frame allows for, like, pragmatically speaking, and maybe this is where it starts to bridge over at MIP, that allows for much better conversations and kind of social cohering, because
Hmm.
people are transparent with how they're actually operating and not adhering to this ideal of multi-perspectivalism that they're never actually going to do anyway.
Yeah. Oh, I was just going to say something. Maybe it's a little bit of a dig, but all too often, I think that those people who claim to be multi-perspectivalists use it more, they weaponize it more as a way of critiquing their opponent. Um, and so they sort of demand that people who hold views that they disagree with be multi-perspectival, um, but they themselves kind of conveniently slip out of the critique themselves.
It's a multi-perspectival for you to take my perspective, right?
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
All too often. And then the other, if they really are being honest with their multi-perspectivalism and applying it to everybody, then the downside of that is that just nobody gets anywhere. It's sort of like Seattle drivers at an intersection. Um, Nobody moves because everybody's waiting to give the other driver a chance to be the first one through through the intersection, and nothing happens. And that's in contrast to like the East Coast, which is maybe the modernist equivalent in this, where everybody just barrels through, and it's each person for their own approach, which kind of embraces both the multi-perspectivalism and the sense of conviction, is you are advocating for your position, but you are interested in having respectful and friendly, not even just respectful, but friendly um, conversations with anybody else who is willing to also give you the same respect. The one approach that I'm not comfortable with, and I don't know if I would call this modernist or what I would call it, but is, well, this is what canceling is all about, which is that by virtue of somebody's belief system, they are considered no longer a worthy subject. But they're almost not considered human. They're not, it's considered immoral for good people to include them in discussion or even in society. So they're to be shunned. And it's called, like, people say, don't platform so and so, because look at all of his views that are so repugnant. Um, so I think the metamodern approach is that the people that you are willing to include in your discussion and treat like their fellow human beings are other people who are willing to treat you like a fellow human being and have respectful discussions, regardless of their view. It does not mean at all that you're conceding that there's any validity or truth or legitimacy to their view. It's just conceding that they're people too, and that you will talk to them and listen and just give them the chance to express their interiority. And then people that are not willing to play by those rules, that's who you ban or whatever from your life, including people that agree with. I mean, that's where it gets weird for me. Is there are people who very much are on the same side as me on many issues, but they are not. I don't even know what the word is for it. They're not meta-ideological politics. They don't do they're not MIPI. Um, and I would rather have dinner with a conservative Republican who is nice than somebody who shares all of my progressive views and dehumanizes everybody that disagrees with them.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. Could one say that the cancel pathology, the phenomenon of cancel culture, and not only on the left but universally,
Yeah.
could one frame that as a postmodern pathology in that we get stuck on the superficiality of their viewer position and can't see into their interiority or into their humanity?
Maybe. I don't disagree with you, but I'm
Uh-huh.
not sure I'm ready to agree with you either.
Yeah.
I don't. It might be a thing that defies. It might. Okay. I'm blowing my own mind here. It might actually also be metamodern in its own perverse way, where it's like a pathologized metamodernism, where their own interiority is so important. It's so important for them to defend not just the truth of the position that they're advocating, but the way it feels to be somebody who holds those truths, namely themselves. So they feel so affronted by people who hold a different narrative that they're doing this. They're doing like a zero-sum version of metamodernism, where they're just desperately protecting their own interiority at the expense of the interiority and personhood of the other. I don't know. I'm just throwing that idea out. I just thought of it right now.
It's very interesting. Yeah, I just thought of that idea myself too. Yeah, that could be, because I remember we talked about how, in your view, the identity politics, excesses of identity politics, is actually a kind of a meta-modern pathology.
Yeah.
When it's commonly attributed in many circles to be a
Right.
distinctly postmodern pathology, but your argument is actually it's a meta-modern pathology.
Yeah. Yeah. I think Jordan Peterson propagated the idea that identity politics is a postmodern thing, but I don't think Jordan Peterson at all understands what postmodernism means. So as I've been grappling with your meta-ideological politics concept, I don't know if this is the case for you, but I've been hoping that meta-ideological politics kind of represents this, what I would consider a meta-modern approach, where you're not asking people to give up their certainty about their own positions, but you're just asking them to treat those who hold differing views as humans.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, absolutely. So I would say there is another part to that. I would say that's the most important part as a foundational principle. I'm wondering what you think of the part two to that, which is not which is the multi-perspectival element to object level considerations. And so I'm wondering how that fits into the equation, and that you by no means have to give up your views or your convictions, your identity or your core values. And I actually, when I lead workshops on certain subjects, I open by telling people that, and that kind of disarms people, and people relax and say, "Oh, good, I don't need to actually change what I believe in. I don't want people to change, what their core values are." Um, but maybe this perspective or this novel information, like kind of be open to it, and let's play with it, let's consider it to kind of enrich our understanding. But I'm not asking you to replace what you believe in with this perspective or completely negate it, but as a kind of supplemental enriching insight. Let's kind of play with that for a little bit.
I think that fits in to,
Okay.
kind of how I see it.
Right.
I mean, it may be a little bit of, maybe in truth, that is kind of a multi-perspectival component, but it's just not taken too far,
It's
I suppose.
it's like, I think I gave you the metaphor of like, to me, pure multi-perspectivalism, pure postmodern multi-perspectivalism. It's like
Right,
all of these perspectives are kind of like equalized together.
right.
Whereas the image I have about my multi-perspectivalism is it's like moons orbiting around the planet.
Hmm.
So it's not like all of the moons are the same size and all of them are equal, but it's more like you have a core, Jupiter or Mars or whatever, right? But
Mm-hmm.
there still are these kind of additional insights, maybe from diverse political schools of thought, that can still kind of enrich your
Mm-hmm.
understanding of politics or other people or
Yeah.
whatever.
And also, even if we would categorize that as like a postmodern thing, well, one way of defining metamodernism is that it's an oscillation between modernist and postmodern approaches. So, so here we'd be oscillating between having a very strong sense of your own position and, on the other hand, being interested in these other positions. and
Yeah,
and and you're not landing solidly on one or the other.
exactly. Um, and I found that this kind of balance, or this kind of how you just described it just pragmatically works the best. Because if we only go for multi-perspectivalism, something doesn't feel right, and also no one does it, and people start getting kind of resentful, as we were talking
Mhm.
about. Too much of the modernist approach, to me, there is I can get a little feeling of like a stagnation. Like I kind of want the postmodernist energy to like kind of shake things up or kind of
Yeah,
fluidicize things.
yeah.
Um, so yeah, that's kind of how I've been presenting it when I teach public workshops or whatever.
I guess I don't
So
have anything to add.
yeah, great. So let's move on to a but related subject about, I don't know if there's a word for this. I've been thinking of them as like the motions or the dynamics of each episteme.
Okay.
So you articulated really well in your talk with Jonathan Rowson and others, something like the postmodernism's motion is to like pull away from the center, I think you said.
Okay.
And I've
I think I didn't actually use that metaphor, but I've heard you use it and it works. But I think you should get credit for that imagery.
oh, funny. Yeah, because I heard you say that on something like that
Yeah,
on
okay.
that recording, and that's how I've always thought about it too. It's like you're radiating from the center towards the context and
Right.
illuminating the contextual parameters that actually inform the object that a more modernist sensibility kind of fixated on, and so you're
Right.
going to the margins. There's a kind of like a
Yes.
so playing with this style of thinking, I want to ask you, well, what are the equivalent dynamics for metamodernism, modernism, and traditionalism? And I have some ideas of what those are, but I'm wondering if you've thought about this and what that would look like if we go through each one.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I can map it onto this kind of physics metaphor of motion towards or away from the center. Um, I think I'm gonna just kind of revert to the way I explain it, and then maybe as we go through, we'll see how it could map into your metaphor. Tradition is unaware of the distinction between center or between object and context. Tradition is unaware of any distinction. It just thinks everything that is, um, and it's what we have because it's been given to us by ancestors, authorities, scripture, the divine, um, and there's no strong distinction between subject and object, or foreground and background, or center and context. Um, and then modernism said, we're actually getting a lot of things wrong when we cling to that way of thinking. and that if you actually are clever and can pull the detritus that's accumulated over the centuries and millennia of our just this trusting tradition, if you can pull that stuff away, like you weed the garden and pull out the weeds, and then what you're left with are the flowers, the actual flowers that you want to appreciate in your garden. Or scientifically, if we can hone in and look at certain things in isolation, we can get a really precise understanding of how they work. And so they put their emphasis on stripping context away and finding out what was objective and universally claimable in things. And then the postmodernists said, when you do that, you're throwing the baby out with the bathwater. That you can't remove the truth from its context, and you can't remove the parts from the system, the parts from the whole, and you have to understand the relationships between things, that things in and of themselves, without taking the relationships to other things into account, are meaningless, that the meaning is actually in the relationship. And that when you try to make decisions about what is at the center and what can be removed, you are going to be blind to the fact that there are other centers that other people can see. And so, as a good postmodernist, you should devote yourself to, coming to understand these other centers and seeing that they're, and as Einstein would say, any one position is just as much can just as much be considered the center, the central organizing perspective as any other. And so that would be kind of the postmodern approach. And then the metamodern approach would be, as you said earlier, that one of the problems you had with multiperspectivalism is that it doesn't leave a place for the self, I think, kind of. Did you say something like that?
Like there's no core centralized authentic thing. It's just like a complete decentralized,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. It's like a funhouse mirror world. And so, metamodernism, or I don't love like going metamodernism says this, because it's not a movement, but metamodernism cultural products are those that are very interested in recapturing and reclaiming that central place for a self to stand and feel like they're real, and feel like they're like they're living in a world. Gosh, to go with the physics metaphor, if modernism was preoccupied with one center and postmodernism was suspicious of the idea of a center, and wary of being too preoccupied with the center and wanted to emphasize context, metamodernism advocates or protects you, whoever you are, your center, while being aware that there are other centers provisionally.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I like that a lot. So I'll tell you my images for the different epistemes, and you can tell me what you think of them.
Okay.
Kind of compare. So to me, modernism, the kind of physics of modernism, is to drive towards a certain point. And I think that's kind of similar to what you were saying, where you're starting with like a wider, maybe like let's say, to use a scientific method as a metaphor, right? You have a hypothesis and you kind of have like a wide breadth of variables or inputs, but then through the scientific process, you consolidate it and drive to a certain point of truth, right? Or to drive towards a certain point. And then that's where the postmodernists come in and say, well, hold on a second. In your driving, in your consolidation towards a single point of truth, you've left out the contextual factors that we should again consider, so we're not blind to them. I think of traditionalism as just trying to hold on to that core. Like if there's a circle and there's a dot in the middle of the circle, it's just holding on to the middle of the circle. And yesterday I was at a like an evangelical Christian apologetics conference. And that was very much the whole flavor of the conference, but it's they were talking about on a kind of civilizational scale, right? So the West has been in a state of decline, and this is what all these bad cultural developments crop up when we abandon God as and tradition as the centerpiece. So we need to hold that center in a, and I like your phrase, the ontological inertia of tradition. It's like, yeah, we're just going to sit in that inertia, and that's what we need to do now, right? Resist moving that or shaking that up at all costs, right? So I do think modernism, compared to that, is a more dynamical process, but it can still arrive at a certain fixed point at which the postmodernists come in and say, hey, we need to shake that up and take the margins, take the circumference of the circle back into consideration. And then metamodernism, yeah, I haven't come up with any coherent image for that, but I like what you said about it.
Yeah, or another way, going back to the oscillation thing, would be to just say it's an oscillation between that modernist focusing in on a center and the postmodern going out in a way, being interested in everything but the center is kind of what postmodernism is, and metamodernism would be this meta thing of moving between an interest in the center and in the context.
I don't know if you would agree with this. It's just I just remembered this. I was reading a book on complexity theory, and the authors in the book were trying to make an argument that complexity theory is an integration of modernism and postmodernism. And their argument was something like, it takes the kind of scientific basis of modernism where there are very tight epistemic constraints, right? So the epistemic constraints associated with, modernism and science and rationality and all that stuff provide a way of honing in on truth. But these environments, these complex systems environments that we're dealing with, that's where the postmodernist aspect comes in, where there is a lot of uncertainty, and you kind of need multiple perspectives to make sense of it. And there's a kind of fluidity and a kind of constant motion. And so you can't get too rigidly locked into a linear process, but there's still epistemic constraints and tools you could use to drive towards more accurate understandings of how the system works, in spite of all of the uncertainty and nebulosity within it. So I don't know if that totally fits into your model of metamodernism, but the way they presented that was kind of an interesting perspective.
That I can see that, and so I have made the argument in the past that systems, complexity science and systems theory are largely postmodern things because they're about relationships. And they're about emphasizing the way things are connected to each other instead of just looking at one thing at a time. But I could see that you could characterize it as metamodern in the way, in the sense that it's postmodern, like I said, in its emphasis on connection and relationship and system. But it's modern. It's a modernist way of discovering truths about how postmodern systems work.
Yeah, something like that. I was just gonna say, I think my objection to that idea of complexity science as metamodernism is that it's not an oscillation, it is an integration of modernism and postmodernism.
Right.
So you're not going
Yeah.
back and forth. It's just, this is what both of them, overlapping with each other.
Yeah, and it also it doesn't pass the vibe test for me. Like, none of that stuff feels metamodern. If metamodernism has to do with Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Community and BoJack Horseman and Bernie Sanders and Barack Obama, somehow, and certain aspects of even the Trump phenomenon, complexity science doesn't feel like that to me. It doesn't feel like it has, how you said, like, your objection to multiperspectivalism is that it leaves no place for there to actually be like an object level thing, and complexity science doesn't feel like it leaves a place for the self. And I think that a lot of, and this is just empirical, but I think that a lot of, or anecdotal, but I think that a lot of people who are interested in complexity science on a science level are also kind of interested in sort of like non-dual post-ego kinds of spiritualities. Like they're sort of trying to like abnegate the self, like that's their goal spiritually. And to me, metamodernism is like a remedy for that kind of abnegation. We were in a place where I don't have like answers that I'll like die on a hill over, and I think that's actually me having an interesting conversation.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. I think just to kind of put a bow on this part, this kind of tangent, I think a lot of it, like certain schools of complexity science, like Santa Fe Institute, are very, very modernist in flavor. Like they're a bunch of scientists getting together and integrating different scientific paradigms, and then writing like computer simulations to come to some new insight into how complex systems work. Like they're getting like information theorists with evolutionary biologists and physicists, right?
Yeah.
And so a lot of people in the complexity science field actually really, from their understanding, poo-poo postmodernism and dislike postmodernism because of its overly relativistic um, and complete loosening of epistemic constraints, and they feel like that's just a completely ascientific nonsense, right? So, but anyway,
Oh, well, no, now I have to say a little bit more.
yeah, go ahead.
Um, so, and I don't want to spend too much of our talk sort of like rebutting other people's views about metamodernism, out there. But there's a view of metamodernism, there's an explanation of metamodernism that like always kind of leaves me feeling a little bit uncomfortable, even though it sounds good, which is when people say metamodernism is where you take the best of tradition and the best of modernism and the best of postmodernism and put it all together. And one problem I have with that is who's to say what's the best of each? And another problem I have with that is that I don't like using this sort of epistemic model to simply promote like the stuff I think is good. I think it's just it's most powerful as a way of describing reality. And so there is good and bad in modernism and good and bad in postmodernism, and there's good and bad in metamodernism. So you can't say metamodernism only has all the good parts of these other epistemes. Now, relating that to sort of the way you just described these complexity scientists, somebody might make the argument that they're metamodern because they're taking the best of modernism, which is using the scientific method and being objective and believing that there's a truth that you can discover, and the best of postmodernism, which is looking at relationships and interconnections and not being stuck in the single object level. But that even if that is metamodernism, that's only like one way of combining the modernist and the postmodern things. And so the opposite of that should also get to be called metamodern, even if it has, everything you dislike from the modernist and the postmodern paradigm. And then another critique of that I would have is that the true kind of meta-modern oscillation is it's not the juxtaposition of certain modernist characteristics and other postmodern characteristics. It's an oscillation between opposites on a continuum. So it's an oscillation between relativism and conviction, or irony and sincerity. It's not taking irony from postmodernism and conviction or universalism or the scientific method or whatever from modernism. It's not, do you know what I'm saying? So it's not like if we were reducing it to like a food metaphor, it's oscillating between chocolate and vanilla, not saying I'm going to take chocolate from modernism and carrots from postmodernism. Like those aren't in opposition to each. Does that make sense? Or am I
Complete sense, yeah. It's with its
okay? I hope
correlating
it makes sense
opposite.
to. I hope it makes sense to anybody besides you that's watching this.
No, that makes complete sense. It's when you're oscillating between the qualities, it's their equal and opposite modern and
Yeah,
postmodern quality, not another random quality from another episteme.
exactly. It's
Yep,
like you're on the same seesaw with
yep,
the, you know, you're on one end of the seesaw, or one of the qualities is on one end of the seesaw, the other's on the other seesaw,
yep.
and then you can't be like, forget it, never mind. You
No,
can't be combining the ends of different seesaws. You have to be oscillating or seesawing on one seesaw.
because right, because if you don't do that, you're not gonna get that distinct feeling as a viewer of the shit.
Yeah,
Like it wouldn't have that
yeah,
coherently meta-modern distinctive flavor. It would be like a
yeah,
random pastiche of different stuff from different
right. Yeah.
epistemes. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, and just one last thing. So a metaphor that I've used kind of to make that distinction is like if you have an art museum and floor one has modernist stuff and floor two has some old, traditional artifacts, and floor three has postmodern stuff, I wouldn't call that altogether a meta-modern museum because you're just on any given floor, you're just in one episteme.
Yep. Makes complete sense.
Okay.
So let's go to kind of the last section that I have been thinking about. And throughout our conversation, you've talked a lot about protecting the self, protecting interiority, some kind of sincere ground of conviction that seems to connote that is exclusively a product of like human consciousness or like dealing with something that can experience subjectivity. But I'm wondering how you would apply that similar theme in the abstract of protecting the interior or something like that from, postmodern deconstruction to non-human things or cultural products. So so the example I want to talk about is OOO, or object-oriented ontology. And so maybe just for the viewers who don't know, Greg, you can give like a 3-minute synopsis of object-oriented ontology and why you told me before that it might have some, kind of meta-modern
Okay.
aspect to it.
And since I'm not a philosopher, I'm going to make my attempt. And then if you feel like you have some things to fill in around the edges or some things I said that I shouldn't get away with, please challenge me or correct me. Um, but so I I've read two books about object orientology. One is called Object Orientology by Graham Harman, and the other is called Hyperobjects by Timothy Morton. And my understanding, especially of Graham Harman's object orient triple O, of Graham Harman's triple O, is so first he's kind of departing from both materialists, philosophical materialists, and philosophical idealists, where the materialists don't really think anything is real besides that which physicists can explain. And at best, the kinds of things that we think of as being kind of in the human world are epiphenomenon. That somehow, it seems absurd to even say it, but that sort of like that's not even sort of real because they're real, but they're only real in the sense that they're grounded in the material. And idealists, as I understand, are people who actually think that what we experience in our minds is the ultimate reality, and that for all we know, what we consider to be the objective material world could just be a projection of our minds. And so they look at ideas and language and concepts as being actually the more fundamental thing than mountains and soil and atoms and molecules. And object-oriented ontology is kind of like both and neither of those. So it's a non-human centric view, but it doesn't reduce objects to their parts. It doesn't reduce complex objects to the lowest level of physics that you can explain things by. And a human is an object too, but so can be a solar system or a forest, or a system of ideas. Harman defines an object, which is at the center of his ontology, as object. An object is that which cannot be undermined or overmined. And undermining is the kind of modernist scientific materialist process of explaining something away as simply being the product of lower level physical processes. And overmining is the postmodern approach of dissolving something into its context and into the forces, the social and cultural forces that it kind of lives in. So that's what overmining and undermining are. And again, Harman says that an object is something that resists. To the extent that a thing resists both overmining and undermining, it's an object. And to me, that's parallel to kind of my definition of metamodern projects, which is that metamodernicultural products protect interiority from modernist scientific reductionism and postmodern relativist contextualization. It's actually interesting because I was having a private conversation with Raven Connolly about metamodernism and object-oriented ontology, and she made me realize, she pointed out that the whole point of object-oriented ontology is that it's about objects, not subjects. And it's saying, like, you don't need this human subject in order for objects to have some meaning of their own. And then in the way I explained metamodernism to her, it seemed to be the opposite of that, because I was saying that metamodernism was about protecting human interiority from these forces. And so then, but to me, they seem really similar. They seem like they're covering the same ground. It's just sort of expanding. It's expanding the scope of metamodernism to include the interiority of objects, not just the interiority of subjects, if that makes sense.
Beautiful. Yeah, I think you explained all of that in exactly the way that I would have attempted to explain it.
Oh, good.
Yeah, because I think what Graham Harman's one thing he's interested in is protecting. The word that comes to my mind, I don't know if this is something I just made up, probably is to protect the integrity of the object at the level of the object. So
Right.
modernist undermining is some kind of scientific reductionism. And the example Harman uses is when the atheist Daniel Dennett talks about wine, the true experience of wine or the real nature of wine is to analyze the molecular structure of wine. That's epitomizes kind of a modernist undermining. You're reducing it to its physical building blocks. Postmodernist overmining is also a form of reductionism, but you're reducing it, as you said, into its larger historical political context, where the art object or the object of analysis is dissolved into the context as if it's nothing more than power relations and cultural perceptions and other kind of systemic relationships that constitute the object, right? So again, to use the circle metaphor, we've completely radiated the object into the periphery of the circle and deconstructed it in doing so.
Right.
So object-oriented ontology comes in and says, we're not going to do either one. We're going to we're going to protect the interiority or integrity of the object at the level of the object. And this is very important when understanding art and kind of saving the arts. Because if you look at a certain work of art or a painting, postmodernist overmining and modernist undermining does violence to the value sphere of that work of art at its own level of
Right.
itself, right?
Right.
But it's not, as you're saying though, it's different from so that protecting the thing at itself has a very metamodern flavor to it, but we're not talking about human subjects, we're talking about objects. And so
Right.
that's why I was curious on would you consider that another expression, object-oriented metamodern? Do you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah, I do. And so I first got interested in finding out what object orientology, triple O. I have to remind myself to say triple O because I can't actually get the full phrase object-oriented ontology out without garbling it. So I first got curious about what triple O was all about. I didn't even know about the overmining, undermining part when I got interested in it. It's just because in my formulations of metamodernism, where I have an article called 11 Methods, 11 Metamodern Methods in the Arts. And it's sort of like a variety of ways that metamodern creators make their stuff metamodern. And one of them that I kind of just came up with intuitively is anthropomorphizing. And so, I say that, like, if you have a movie and you treat a car like it's a person in the movie, or like in Everything Everywhere All at Once, where they put the googly eyes on all these different things and then they feel like people when you see the eyes on them. And that's anthropomorphized. When you project human experience onto non-human things, that's anthropomorphizing, and that is a metamodern method because you're sort of like projecting interiority into things and into objects. And so when I heard that there was a movement in philosophy called object-oriented ontology, I thought, oh, that might be an example of metamodern anthropomorphizing. And when I started reading Graham Harman, and when he made his claim at the beginning of the book that this was like a non-human centered ontology, at first I was skeptical because as I was reading it, I thought, none of the stuff he's talking about would even be relevant or meaningful if you didn't have the human perspective, asking questions about these objects and putting interpretations onto them. But as I read it, I actually, this only has happened to me a few times in my life from reading a book, I actually had a transformation of consciousness, where I came to understand that for a true object, something that resists overmining and undermining, it doesn't require the human interpretation for it to have its objectiness. So you could take humans entirely out of the picture, and there would be objects that have a sort of interior complexity to them interacting with each other without needing humans to observe them and go, oh, that's kind of like two people or whatever interacting. And I had a visceral experience of that when I was getting stitches for a cut on my thumb. And the doctor, he gave me a topical anesthetic so I wouldn't feel pain. And then he started sewing my skin together. And so I didn't have any pain, but I could feel the skin being pulled together, right? And I've never had stitches before, and yet it was a really familiar experience to me. It was like I'm totally familiar with this experience. And I realized that I've experienced it from the other end when I'm sewing stuff together. And normally, the two pieces of fabric that you're sewing together are an object out there, and you, the human doer, have this sort experience of bringing them together and feeling a tension in them and all that. Whereas here, I was the fabric, and I was having the experience of being sewn, and it was the exact mirror image of the experience I was familiar with of sewing an object, if that makes sense. And I wouldn't have been able to appreciate that without the concept of triple O.
Yeah, totally. That makes sense. It's really cool. Yeah, so the theme, the idea of protecting the object from undermining and overmining and meeting it at the integrity of where it's at, that to me is a really strong instinct. And I'm not necessarily saying that this is a meta-modern quality, because it may not be, but in meta-ideological politics, a really important thing to me personally is to protect the level of the ideas or the ideology at the level of the ideas or the ideology, away from different kind of straw manning distortions. And I get into two types of arguments with people, the postmodernists and the modernists. So the postmodernists want to deconstruct an ideological frame or school of thought into its, into your kind of socio-cultural backdrop, right? So if someone is a Christian conservative, Christian conservatism is not its own coherent ideology with its own set of interests and values and ideas. It's just a product of white supremacist socialized conditioning, right? Then there are people who are of a more modernist bent who criticize me and say, we don't have that any kind of frames for understanding reality, any kind of heuristics that we use, any systems of thought and values and ideals that inform our policy positions that we hold. That should all be replaced with critical thinking and just looking at facts. You don't need ideology, you don't need abstractions. It's just a matter of factual reduction. When again, okay, I understand why someone would say that, but no one actually does that in person, right? And so it's like so when I talk to people, whether I talk to people, left, right, or center, it's important for me to be able to find some resonance or some connection to their school of thought so I can meet them and their ideology on their own terms, even if I disagree with the content because I have my own beliefs. So I may disagree with the specifics, but my ability to tune into the structure of feeling of their school of thought, and then to have a conversation that respects their relationship with their own ideas, is the tool that allows me to build relationships with extremists, frankly. Where if I didn't do that technique, I would lose my mind and lose my patience talking to people with crazy beliefs and in my
Right.
opinion, really damaging beliefs, right? So it's like tuning into
Right.
the aesthetic, emotive backdrop of their ideas is what allows me to build a relationship with them as a person, even
Right.
if I hard disagree with the specifics.
Right.
So to me, the object-oriented ontology idea of like meeting the object at the level that it's at and not overmining or undermining it is what I do with political ideologies and people who hold them, if that makes sense.
That makes a lot of sense. And I would say that's a meta-modern approach.
Okay.
And I've brought this example up in too many podcast interviews, probably, but I just love it so much, is it makes me think of Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Because one of the things I love about Buffy is that even as she's completely dedicated to destroying like a particular vampire or demon that she's going up against, because she has to save the world, or to save like another person that the vampire was going to try to kill or whatever. But when she engages with these opponents, she doesn't undermine or overmine them. She like the whole time she's fighting them, she'll be having a conversation with them as if they're a worthy conversation partner and meeting them on their terms. Like, so she's not going to spare them in terms of their life or their existence. But in those moments, in those last moments, while they're engaging, she's like fully present to them as a, as a conversation partner or dance partner or, martial arts opponent or however you want to see it, rather than undermining them as just some material that needs to be destroyed, or overmining them as an entity that's like a representative of some kind of disgraceful belief system or, you know, product of cultural forces or something like that. And I know in your work, you're not actually out there to like win a ideological battle. So you're not exactly like Buffy, because you actually are just being present with people. But I feel like somebody who actually is, you know, committed to actually like winning a ideological battle could still take that Buffy style approach or that object oriented ontology or meta-ideological politics approach, where like even though like you're 100% committed to winning the election or winning the debate or winning the legislation, you know, or whatever it is, or winning the hearts and minds of society over to your side, you still respect the interiority of the opponent as much as they're willing to let you.
Exactly. Yeah. Man, I really got to watch Buffy the Vampire Slayer sometime.
Yeah. And watch, you have to watch it past the first season. You have to watch the whole
Okay.
first season. You have to get through like the first 3 or 4 episodes, and then it becomes fun and it'll keep you going. But you have to get into like the second, third, and fourth seasons before you are like start questioning, why did Greg think it was so important to, you know, like it gets profound. It gets fun in the first season, but it gets profound in the later seasons.
Okay, good to know. I'll hang in there. Yeah, um what interests me about this conversation is that, and I've written about this elsewhere, um we live in an age where people's political ideology, especially if you're on the extreme end of the spectrum, has really merged with their personal identity, sense of self, and sense of interiority, right? So if their
Mm-hmm.
ideology or beliefs, political beliefs, were criticized or challenged, a lot of people take that to be a personal attack, right? It's like if you attack my
Mm-hmm.
political beliefs, you are attacking myself directly.
Yeah.
And so what I had to discover, again, especially working with extremists, is that it can be hard to completely separate the person's ideas from the person. So there are some schools of conversation and dialogue that advocate for a pro-human approach, which is just put the ideology aside and just talk to people as people about non-politicized subjects. And I can tell you that that's almost impossible to do for a lot of people. Whether there are Christian conservatives who I was talking to yesterday, where every other word is something about God and the Christian path, and they told me that being pro-life is not a political issue; it's a biblical issue. People on the left would say Black Lives Matter is not a political issue; it's a human rights issue. Right. So it's like,
Right.
even if these are highly politicized issues, and it's probably fair to categorize all of them as political issues, advocates of these issues on their side look at it as something beyond politics or more spiritually fundamental than politics. And so it's so to completely bracket and posit a hard distinction between someone's political beliefs and their sense of self, their morality, their worldview it's so hard to do that. So my approach was to, if I can first build a relationship with their ideas and respect
Mm.
how they relate to their ideas, that actually is an into their interiority, sadly, these days,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And I have some colleagues who really don't like that approach. They have a pro-human approach, and this, like, let's just talk as people. And I can tell you that absolutely does not work when you're talking to Antifa and some white supremacist group or whatever. It's like you have to
What
start with your
happened?
ideas.
What
Oh,
does happen when you do that?
um it's like, well, how could you put aside all of these important issues, like I'm here to, it-
Yeah.
you, and especially you as of this ideological background or of this identity group, that also has an immediate impact, whether it's that we're funded by the Department of Homeland Security. Okay, so you have some association with government. All right, I'm out. Or you're a white male, I'm out.
Right.
You're not a Christian, I'm out. Right.
Right.
So it's like,
Okay,
so
so from that point of view, um, to be breaking bread, you know, so to speak, and sort of the pro-human approach is like is atrocious, because it's like they would be if I was Black Lives Matter and someone was asking me to sit down with Ku Klux Klan members, And then that mediator said, well, let's not get into the politics. Let's just, what did everybody have for breakfast? Or what's something that everybody's looking forward to this week that's non-political, that's going to bring joy to you or whatever. If I was in Black Lives Matter, I would be insulted that you thought I would take the Ku Klux Klan members seriously as people who would have had something for breakfast. Like, why would I care what this monster had for breakfast? Why would I even want to sit at a table with them? We have to hash out the political stuff first, and if they have any room for having some respect for the Ku Klux Klan members, it would lie in the possibility that they can resolve something on the political level that is not quite as extreme as they feared, and then they're willing to joke around about regular everyday life. Is that kind of the
That's a fantastic
perspective?
example, because it's a great example because it's like, one, the Black Lives Matter people, it would be like, are we not going to talk about the biggest elephant in the room, where the entire identity and essence of my opponent sitting across the table are a political entity, and and as a result of that, a threat to my being, my identity, my world, my race, my worldview, my everything, right? So that's the first part, and then the second thing is, in a kind of weird, twisted way, I think that when people's identities and interiority is so merged with their ideology,
Mm-hmm.
that talking to people on the terms of their ideology is actually the pro-human approach of going to their identity.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Which is,
Mm-hmm.
again, it's a really sad state of affairs in my view, that is the case, but sometimes that is the only thing that can be done. So in that way, I see the two approaches as being, having a lot of overlap with each other. It's like the only way to get to your interiority is through the lens of your ideas, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah. And then I think that sometimes you might have a conflict between, okay, on one side, you might have a group of people who have like a really clear political motivation for their positions, which they also feel are not just political but moral. But then the other side might not be symmetrical. It might be people who, like, if you take like the Gamergate controversy between feminists and between ostensibly apolitical gamers, the feminists say the way you guys behave and the way the game industry works and the way most games are designed and everything like that is misogynist, and that has to be corrected. And the gamers say this is not supposed to be political. This is a thing we do for fun. This is a place where we retreat to experience our interiority, and you're overmining it. You're attempting to overmining it by reducing it to an aspect of a political debate. And that's where I draw the line my line in the sand is, I'm not, they might go, I'm not even anti-feminist. It's just that you don't get to come in and interfere with the experience of this thing that's kind of sacred to me, which is my playing of the game. So, like in that case, it's not exactly symmetrical, and the debate is, I don't know exactly how to, like, you could have one case is where like they're equally political and where the politics are merged with the identity. And then another case, one of the sides would just say this shouldn't be political at all. I don't know. Can you make sense of what I'm saying there?
that does make sense. Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting example. I'll have to think more about taking that dynamic, taking that asymmetry of politicization into consideration. Um, and that question, that tension itself is something that I think a lot about too, kind of meta-ideologically, of like the classic feminist mantra since the 60s, right, is the personal is political. And so that was kind of
Hmm.
a kind of beginning of an overmining that occurred, but at the same time, I think had produced some good insights, right? Like there are like the kind of postmodernist contribution to the
Right.
conversation that there were politicized things or things that have political implications that we previously consigned to strictly the personal domain. And
Right. So one kind of conflict, the thing I'm trying to tease out here would be in one type of conflict, you have two groups who both agree that the personal is political, but their politics are in conflict with each other. And in another type of these conflicts, you have one group who thinks that the personal is political and they have a particular political point of view. And then you have another group who denies, and they're probably wrong, but from their point of view, they deny that the personal is political. And their stand for no, the personal is just personal. And nobody has the right to politicize my personal. Once you grant me that, I'm willing to debate the politics with you, and you may be surprised that I don't disagree with you as much as you think I did. I think that would be their stance.
yeah, totally, totally. And I think what I would do in that situation with the gamer side is to really go into whatever frame or paradigm they're in where they initially don't think that that's political in that like so if it is whatever personal sphere that they're ensconced in, that is itself the opening into a deeper level, right? And then for the feminist side or the more political side or the politicizing side, I can start with the politicization as the dominant frame and then from there merge into the personal behind it, so to speak. But
Yeah.
yeah, it's tricky. It's tricky issues to adjudicate. Yeah, Greg, thank you. We've been going for over an hour and a half, but this has been a really fruitful conversation and answered a lot of my questions on everything related to metamodernism and more, oscillation and multiperspectivalism and OOO. So, thank you so much for such an illuminating conversation. Any final thoughts or last words?
Just that I'm really gratified to see how this metamodernism stuff, does seem to be really relevant to meta-ideological politics. I recognize there was some overlap, but now I feel like there's even more um, cross relevance there. And so this has definitely been a cool conversation for me as well. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thanks a lot, Greg.